Have you ever looked at someone who is incredibly fit?
Like a dedicated gym fanatic.
Yeah, exactly. Someone who's consistently lifting heavy, doing endless reps. They look completely chiseled.
The picture of perfect health.
Right. And you automatically assume their body is functioning perfectly. You look at them and think, they must have total physical freedom.
It's the standard assumption we all make.
It really is. But today's mission is to completely shatter that assumption. We are exploring the hidden trap of modern fitness culture.
Which is such a needed conversation.
Absolutely. We're looking closely at how brute strength can actually become a physical prison and discovering the secret to unlocking true bodily freedom.
It is a phenomenal topic because it completely flips our conventional understanding of what it means to be in shape.
It really does.
It forces us to look beyond the aesthetic and, examine the actual availability of the human body.
To guide us on this journey, we have some fantastic source material today.
Really incredible stuff.
We are pulling from a deeply insightful interview conducted by Farid Gabi with movement educator and Pilates expert Caroline Berger de Fémynie.
Her insights are they're game-changing.
You really are. Caroline shares a story in this interview that fundamentally challenges how we approach physical training. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
She details a very specific, revealing case study of a student she had in a Pilates training program.
A student with a very intense background.
Right. This student had a heavy fitness past, intense gym work, heavy loads, and incredible discipline.
The kind of person who never misses a workout.
Exactly. On paper, this woman was ultra fit. She should have navigated a Pilates mat without breaking a sweat.
What's fascinating here is that this story quickly reveals itself to be about so much more than just a workout routine.
Oh, absolutely.
It is a profound look at the neurology of movement, the deeply misunderstood role of fascia, and ultimately why a strong body is not necessarily a stable or an available body.
Let's look at what actually happened when this ultra-fit student hit the mat.
This is where it gets crazy.
Caroline asked her to perform a series of fundamental Pilates exercises, starting with the classic roll-up.
Which is pretty basic, right?
You'd think so. But it wasn't just difficult for the student, it was impossible.
Completely blocked.
Yes. Her body actively refused the movement, locking up completely. She couldn't initiate the spinal flexion required at all.
Not even a little bit.
So what is happening mechanically and neurologically when someone with that much sheer physical power simply cannot perform a foundational movement?
That paradox is the core of the issue here. To understand why a highly trained body fails at a fundamental task, we have to look at the concept of segmental differentiation.
Segmental differentiation.
Exactly. In disciplines like Pilates, the goal is often to move the spine vertebra by vertebra.
Like a bicycle chain.
That is the perfect analogy. You want each segment to articulate independently while the pelvis remains stable and free of tension.
But this student couldn't do that.
No. Her intense training had conditioned her to operate as a single global block.
A global block.
Right. She was highly toned and incredibly strong, but she possessed almost zero differentiation in her movements.
So she was just moving all at once.
Yes. When she tried to articulate her spine, her nervous system only knew how to fire everything simultaneously.
It makes me think of having a high-performance sports car with a massive roaring engine.
Oh, I like this.
But the steering wheel is completely welded shut.
Yes.
You have all this incredible power, but you have zero maneuverability.
Yeah.
You can only go straight, and if you try to take a nuanced corner, the whole system just fights you.
That lack of maneuverability has severe consequences in a movement setting.
I can imagine.
Because she lacked that segmental mobility, attempting those exercises wasn't just ineffective. It was actively contraindicated for her in that moment.
It was actually bad for her to try.
Exactly. Her body was substituting tension for articulation, and that immediately triggers compensation and pain.
The interview lists the specific failures, painting such a clear picture of this global block phenomenon.
It wasn't just the roll-up, was it?
No. She also couldn't perform rolling like a ball or the jackknife.
Classic flexion movements.
Right. What is it about those specific movements that completely short-circuits a system operating without segmental differentiation?
Well, all of those movements require a highly sophisticated set of mechanics. They blend simultaneous mobility and stability.
Two things at once.
Exactly. The spine has to flex and stabilize at the same time, while the pelvis has to accept a controlled tilt.
And if you're a single rigid block?
You simply cannot distribute the mechanical load across the joints. You can't dissipate the force.
So there's nowhere for the energy to go.
Right. Instead of a smooth rolling articulation, the student experienced immediate rigidity. She actually described the sensation to Caroline as feeling like she was trapped in a vice.
Wow. Trapped in a vice. And it gets wilder. There is this one detail from the source that is equal parts fascinating and slightly terrifying.
Terrifying if you've ever experienced it, for sure.
Right. Especially if you've ever had your own body pull the emergency brake on you mid-stretch.
Oh, yeah.
When this student even attempted an extension or a posterior stretch, her glute muscles would tetanize.
It would just lock up.
Completely. They would violently spasm, like a protective light switch being flicked on the second she moved into that range.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we start to see the shift from biomechanics to neurology.
Okay, break that down for us.
We aren't just dealing with mechanical stiffness here, like someone having short hamstrings from deadlifting.
Right, this is deeper.
This is a profound neurological response. The nervous system is the body's ultimate security guard.
The bouncer of the body.
Exactly. When she attempted these movements, her central nervous system perceived the required range of motion as a direct threat.
A threat to her safety.
Yes. It looked at the movement pattern, realized it didn't have the mapped segmental control to execute it safely, and triggered a massive defensive contraction.
Just to stop her from moving into what it deemed unsafe territory.
Precisely. It was hitting the brakes to save the spine.
Caroline brings up a really interesting suspect for why this specific alarm system was so incredibly sensitive: the piriformis.
Ah, yes, the piriformis.
She hypothesized that the student might be dealing with a localized hyperprotection issue there, creating a cascading failure throughout the entire pelvic region.
The localization pattern here is critical. The piriformis is deeply intimate with the sciatic nerve.
And we all know how painful sciatic issues can be.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh.
When a deep stabilizer like the piriformis gets overworked, maybe from years of heavy bilateral lifting without adequate rotational or lateral work.
Which is super common in standard gym routines.
Exactly. It goes into a state of chronic hyperprotection.
Yeah.
That chronic tension can severely irritate the sciatic nerve.
And once that nerve is irritated,
It disrupts the neural signaling to everything connected to the hip, the pelvis, and the lumbar spine. It throws the entire lumbopelvic region into a total lockdown.
so the glute spasms she was experiencing during extension,
Those were the outward symptom of this deep internal neurological panic.
which perfectly explains why trying to do a smooth rolling sit-up was setting off alarm bells. Her hips were essentially screaming at her not to move.
Screaming.
In standard fitness culture, the toxic advice here is usually to push through the pain.
No pain, no gain, right? The worst advice.
Right, to force the rep. But Caroline's approach was the complete opposite. She abandoned the ego entirely, stepped back, and told the student something amazing.
What does she say?
She said, "If your body can't express it today, it doesn't mean you're weak. It means we're going to build the right step."
That specific response is the hallmark of smart pedagogy.
It's so refreshing to hear.
Forcing a lock system to perform a complex movement only reinforces the perceived threat. It validates the nervous system's panic.
It proves the bouncer right.
Exactly. You cannot build complex articulation on a foundation that lacks basic mobility and tissue relaxation.
So what do you do instead?
You have to manufacture the environment for the movement to emerge naturally, rather than forcing the body to comply through sheer willpower.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Caroline didn't just offer verbal reassurance. She actively changed the physical environment to communicate safety to the student's nervous system.
This is the genius part.
She altered gravity by using the edge, essentially moving the student to an inclined surface or slope to practice the roll-up.
The biomechanical brilliance of that choice cannot be overstated.
Because it changes the physics.
Entirely. Consider the physics of a roll-up on a flat floor. To lift the torso, the spine has to overcome a massive lever arm.
Fighting directly against gravity.
Right, while simultaneously forcing the entire posterior chain into a deep, sustained stretch.
Which is a lot to ask.
For a nervous system already on high alert, that mechanical demand is completely overwhelming.
So the incline changes that.
Yes. By placing the student on an incline, Caroline fundamentally altered the body's orientation to gravity. She drastically reduced the immediate mechanical torque on the spine.
And lessened the stretch demand on the posterior chain?
Exactly. She created a safe neurological corridor where the joints could actually experience articulation without immediately hitting that wall of resistance.
She also utilized specific props. And the source makes it clear these were used with intense intention.
Not just to make the pose look pretty.
Exactly. She had the student utilize light adduction with a small ball.
Squeezing the legs slightly.
Right. How does a seemingly minor adjustment like lightly squeezing a ball completely change the safety profile of the movement for the nervous system?
That light adduction is a masterclass in targeted stabilization.
A masterclass.
Truly. By engaging the adductor slightly, you help anchor and stabilize the pelvis.
Which gives the nervous system a sense of security.
Yes. But more importantly, you achieve that pelvic stability without overloading the hip flexors.
Ah, because the hip flexors were already freaking out.
Precisely. In this student's case, they were already likely locked in a state of high alert to protect the lumbar spine.
You don't want to trigger them further.
Exactly. The profound lesson here is about the true purpose of movement modification. You don't use props to artificially achieve a range of motion or fake the aesthetic of a pose.
You use them to downregulate the threat.
You use them to actively downregulate the perceived threat to the nervous system. You're engineering the exact physical environment where the body feels secure enough to say yes instead of screaming no.
So they are using the slope, they're utilizing the ball, communicating safety, creating this highly engineered environment.
Doing everything right mechanically.
Right. But the source reveals that by the third day of the training, they hit a hard plateau.
The progress completely stalled out.
It did. Despite all these incredibly smart biomechanical and environmental modifications, the student's body was still fundamentally stuck.
Which leads to the big realization.
Yes, that is when Caroline had a massive realization that changed the entire trajectory of the session. They were trying to treat the movement without treating the tissue.
This realization is the absolute pivot point of the case study.
It changes everything.
It brings us squarely into the realm of fascia.
Fascia. The buzzword everyone hears but maybe doesn't fully grasp.
Right. Fascia is the continuous web of connective tissue that wraps, penetrates, and connects every muscle, bone, nerve, and organ in the body.
Like a full-body internal wetsuit.
Perfect way to picture it. When we talk about healthy fascia, we are talking about tissue that is hydrated and supple, allowing the various layers of muscle to glide smoothly past one another during movement.
But when someone engages in years of repetitive, heavy fitness training,
Focusing entirely on hypertrophy and load.
right, while completely neglecting tissue release or recovery, what happens to that three-dimensional web?
The fascia fundamentally adapts to the stress being placed upon it. It loses its hydration and becomes dense.
It dries out.
Basically, yes, the layers become sticky and adhered to one another, losing their capacity for glide.
And when those layers are glued down like that,
Movement becomes incredibly expensive for your body. It takes immense effort to overcome the internal friction. It restricts joint mechanics, and it often results in radiating pain.
so you're fighting your own tissue.
You literally lose your biological capacity for smooth articulation, regardless of how strong the underlying muscle fibers might be. The tissue architecture itself becomes a restrictive bodysuit.
Caroline completely shifts gears at this point. The transformation in the studio approach is radical.
They throw the original plan out the window.
They really do. They completely stop doing Pilates.
Entirely.
Instead, they pivot entirely to myofascial release, spending their time applying gentle pressure, slow mobilization, and focusing heavily on deep, calming breathing.
Which is the total opposite of a heavy gym session.
Totally. Why is this slow, breath-focused approach so critical when dealing with highly densified tissue?
Well, working with fascia is not about mechanically forcing a change in the tissue.
Like aggressively kneading out a knot.
Right. You can't just mash it into submission. It is a direct conversation with the autonomic nervous system.
Back to the nervous system.
Always. The highly densified fascia is rich in mechanoreceptors. When you apply gentle, sustained pressure, combined with slow mobilization and deep diaphragmatic breathing,
You're sending a message.
you are sending a very specific signal up the neural pathways. You are telling the central nervous system that the environment is safe, the threat has passed, and it can command the local tissues to drop the protective armor.
Wow.
You are treating the neurological holding pattern just as much as you are treating the physical tissue adherence.
The climax of this story in the interview is incredible. After dedicating this time strictly to fascia release, Caroline asks the student to try the movement again.
Just a simple spinal roll.
Just a simple spinal roll. And the physical response is immediate and undeniable. The glute spasms are completely gone.
The alarm system is turned off.
That terrifying vice grip around her pelvis vanishes. The student looks at Caroline and says, "I've never felt this. I never felt it could be so fluid."
That gives me chills.
Right. She went from fighting an absolute war with her own physical structure to actually feeling it and moving within it effortlessly.
That breakthrough encapsulates the profound difference between two fundamentally opposing physical strategies.
Which are?
Well, this student's entire intensive fitness background had wired her for one specific strategy: control by tension.
Control by tension.
Yes, she knew how to brace, how to lock down her global system, and how to force a movement pathway through sheer muscular willpower.
But Caroline was teaching something else.
Yes, what fluid movement disciplines ultimately aim for is control by organization.
Control by organization. I love that phrasing.
True physical mobility isn't about the maximum force you can generate or how hard you can contract a muscle group. It's about how elegantly your neuromuscular system coordinates and cooperates.
It's finesse over force.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As Caroline beautifully articulated in the interview, force without mobility doesn't create stability. It just creates rigidity.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now?
Good question.
Whether you are someone who hits the weight room religiously, runs long distances, or honestly, even if you just sit at a desk hunched over a keyboard for 10 hours a day.
Which is most of us.
True. Your body might be operating with only one strategy to deal with physical stress: locking up.
Just bracing for impact.
Right. You might possess incredible strength or endurance, but you might just be holding your entire skeletal structure together with chronic tension.
A house of cards made of tight muscles.
There is a quote from Caroline in the source that feels like it should be the foundational rule of any training program.
Oh, I know the one you mean.
She says you don't correct a body by constraining it, you transform it by giving it options.
That statement forces us to question how we view fitness as a culture.
It really does.
This story of the rigid, ultra-fit student serves as a perfect metaphor for our modern era.
We are a very tense society.
We live in a society deeply obsessed with intensity. We heavily value repetition, we prioritize speed, and we idolize the aesthetic of looking hard or chiseled.
It's all about how it looks on the outside.
But in the relentless pursuit of those metrics, we have largely forgotten the value of finesse. We overlook the absolute necessity of breath mechanics.
We ignore recovery.
We completely ignore the critical importance of long-term tissue health. We are highly successful at building bodies that are incredibly strong and visually impressive.
But functionally.
Functionally, they are essentially imprisoned within their own tension.
It's a profound shift in perspective regarding what true health actually looks like. To recap the journey we've been on today,
It's been a ride.
we started by exploring the paradox of how a hyperfit body can actually be neurologically and fascially locked down.
The welded steering wheel.
Exactly. We examine how deep stabilizing muscles, like the piriformis, act as emergency brakes when the nervous system perceives an unmanageable threat.
The bouncer doing its job.
And we learned that true physical freedom doesn't come from pushing harder against resistance. It comes from hydrating the fascial web, respecting the nervous system's absolute need for safety, and providing the body with structural options rather than forcing it through a wall of pain and restriction.
It ultimately comes down to recognizing that the outward appearance of fitness and the internal reality of physical availability are frequently two entirely different things.
We have to train for the latter if we want longevity.
Exactly.
I want to reiterate one more beautiful sentiment from Caroline's interview to really anchor this concept. She states, "The body is not an object we push. It is a system we listen to."
If we take that concept of listening to the system one step further, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Go for it.
We've spent this time analyzing how repetitive physical stress densifies the fascia and locks the body into a rigid protective armor.
Right.
But consider the depths of the mind-body connection. What if the chronic emotional and psychological stress you carry every single day,
The relentless deadlines.
the anxiety, the ambient pressures of life, what if all of that is actually being stored and mapped in that exact same connective tissue?
Wow.
What if unlocking your physical rigidity through gentle, communicative fascia release isn't just the key to finally touching your toes?
But something much deeper.
What if it is actually the biological key to releasing years of trapped mental and emotional rigidity as well?
That is definitely something to think about the next time you feel your shoulders creeping up to your ears during a stressful day.
Just take a breath.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this conversation encourages you to approach your next workout, or honestly, even just your next deep breath, with a little more listening, a little more grace, and a little less pushing. We'll catch you next time.